Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. Nora and I left Denver on a Wednesday afternoon in November 2022, heading south toward Albuquerque, where her sister lived with her husband and their 2 children. By then, we had been married for 6 years, and that Thanksgiving trip had almost become a tradition for us, a chance to step away from the routine for a few days and spend time with family before the chaos of December arrived. I had just finished my shift at the warehouse where I had worked since finishing school back in 2014. Nora picked me up right at the entrance so we could get on the road without wasting time. Between the two of us, she was the one who organized everything. She was the one who planned the rest stops and calculated our arrival time almost down to the minute. She had a whole method for those trips. A cooler with sandwiches and fruit, a thermos full of black coffee, and a list of true crime podcasts ready on her phone. I loved seeing her in those moments before a trip, the way she checked everything twice and made little notes in the margins of the printed directions. That afternoon, she was wearing my old college sweater, and her hair was tied up in a messy bun. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who, after so many years together, could still make me smile. She kissed me on the cheek when I sat down in the driver's seat and told me we would arrive at her sister's house by dawn. We crossed into New Mexico around 9 at night. The landscape grew darker and lonelier with every mile we drove south of Raton. The highway cut through hills and valleys that seemed to swallow the light, and there were stretches where the only things visible were the white line along the edge of the road and the faint glow of a few ranch lights far away. Nora had fallen asleep around 10 o'clock, her head resting against the passenger side window and my jacket rolled up under her cheek. I left the radio on at a low volume. It was a local station playing old country songs, interrupted by static every time we passed through an area without signal. The temperature outside had dropped into the low 30s, and I could feel the cold seeping in through the gaps in the car's old weather stripping. We were driving a Subaru Outback that had belonged to my father before he died. It had almost 200,000 miles on it, but it still ran like a dream. Around 11:30 on some desolate stretch of I-25 between Raton and Las Vegas, New Mexico, I saw a pair of headlights in the rearview mirror approaching at high speed. A dark pickup truck pulled up beside us, and the driver started honking while desperately pointing toward the back of our car. I slowed down and lowered the window a little, squinting against the icy wind that suddenly rushed into the cabin. The man in the truck was shouting something I could not quite understand, but he kept pointing at our rear tire and making a cutting motion with his hand. Nora woke up beside me, blinking in confusion as she tried to understand what was happening. I told her someone was signaling for us to pull over, that it looked like maybe we had a flat tire or something dragging underneath. She rubbed her eyes and leaned forward to look through the windshield at the truck, which had now pulled ahead and was braking on the wide shoulder about 50 yards in front of us, with its hazard lights flashing. I remember hesitating for barely a second. Something inside me told me to keep driving, but the logical part of my mind took over. If we really did have a flat tire, continuing to drive could destroy the rim and leave us stranded somewhere even worse. I pulled over behind the truck. Our headlights lit up the back of a mud-splattered Dodge Ram with New Mexico plates. The man got out and started walking toward us. That was when I could see he was tall, maybe 6'3" or 6'4", wearing a denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled down so low it almost covered his face. I told Nora to stay inside the car and keep the doors locked while I checked. She nodded, still half asleep, and I stepped out into the freezing night air with my phone flashlight ready. The man met me halfway between our vehicles. Up close, he looked to be in his 40s, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they had spent decades doing hard labor. He had a fairly friendly smile, the kind that wrinkles the corners of the eyes, and he told me he had been driving behind us for several miles and had seen sparks coming from the rear left tire. I thanked him and walked around the car to check, crouching down to get a better look. The tire looked fine to me. It was fully inflated, had no visible damage, no loose hubcap, and nothing that could have caused sparks. I stood up and turned to tell him that everything seemed to be in order. And that was when I noticed he had moved much closer than before. He was now about 3 feet away from me. The smile had disappeared from his face, replaced by an expression I still cannot describe exactly. It was empty, completely expressionless, like a mask someone had forgotten to put features on. I asked him if he was sure which tire he had seen, trying to keep my voice from shaking, but he only tilted his head slightly to one side without answering. The next few seconds happened so quickly that my memory keeps them in fragments, like scattered photographs. I remember turning toward our car, wanting to put distance between myself and that man whose attitude had suddenly changed into something predatory. I remember seeing Nora's face through the windshield, her eyes wide with fear as she watched the scene. And then I felt a hand grab my shoulder from behind, thick fingers digging into the muscle so hard they left bruises I would still have a week later. I spun around and saw something metallic flash in the dim light from the headlights. It was a blade about 6 inches long that he had pulled from somewhere inside his jacket. He did not say a word. He just swung a horizontal slash aimed at my throat. The only reason he missed was because I stumbled backward and tripped over my own feet. I hit the gravel hard. The impact knocked the air out of me, and I heard Nora scream from inside the car. The man stepped over me as if I were nothing more than an obstacle. His boots crunched over the frozen ground as he calmly walked toward the driver's door, where Nora was trying to work her phone. I got up as best I could, shouting for her to run, to get out the other side and go into the darkness where he could not follow her. But she was panicking. Her fingers were not responding as she tried to unlock the phone and call for help. The man reached the car and hit the window with his fist so hard I thought the glass was going to break. Nora screamed again and finally threw herself over the center console toward the passenger door, but she was tangled in the seatbelt she had forgotten to unbuckle. I ran toward him from behind without thinking, acting only on adrenaline and terror. I rammed into him at the waist, and we both fell onto the pavement. The knife flew out of his hand and slid somewhere underneath our car. He was stronger than me, much stronger. Within seconds, he managed to reverse our positions and pin me to the ground, one knee pressing against my chest. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell cigarette smoke and something sour on his breath as he wrapped both hands around my neck. The world started to turn gray around the edges. Sounds became muffled, distant. The last thing I saw before my vision closed in like a tunnel was Nora finally getting out through the passenger door and running toward the empty road. Then suddenly his weight disappeared from on top of me. I heard his footsteps pounding away in the same direction she had run. I stayed there lying on the ground, gasping for air, my throat burning and my vision slowly returning. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. When I tried to shout Nora's name, only a hoarse whisper came out. I forced myself onto my hands and knees, then staggered to my feet, using the side of the car for support. The highway stretched in both directions, empty and silent, except for the wind howling over the open plain. I could not see Nora. I could not see the man. The darkness beyond our headlights was absolute, a black wall that could have been hiding anything. I staggered forward in the direction I had seen her run. My legs barely obeyed me as the adrenaline began to fade and the pain settled in. I shouted her name again and again, my voice gaining a little strength with each attempt. But the only answer was the wind. About 200 yards from the car, I found her shoe. It was a white sneaker, the same one she had been wearing since we left Denver, lying on its side in the middle of the road. I picked it up and kept walking. I kept calling her. I kept praying to a God I had not spoken to in years. I found her maybe 50 yards farther ahead, just off the shoulder, where the gravel gave way to brush and frozen dirt. She was lying on her back, completely still, her eyes open and staring at the stars. The front of her sweater, my old college sweater, was dark and wet in a way I understood immediately, though I refused to accept it. I fell to my knees beside her and took her hand. It was still warm. It still felt like her, but there was no pulse beneath my fingers. I kept saying her name. I kept asking her to wake up. I kept promising her that help was coming and that everything was going to be all right. But she did not blink. She did not breathe. The wound in her throat was deep, almost surgical in its precision, and the blood had already stopped flowing because there was no more blood left to flow. I do not know how long I stayed there on my knees, holding her hand in the middle of that freezing darkness. It could have been 5 minutes or an hour. Time stopped meaning anything. At some point, I realized headlights were approaching from the north. It was a freight truck that slowed as it passed our abandoned car and then stopped on the shoulder when the driver saw me kneeling among the brush. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Hank. He called 911 while wrapping his own jacket around my shoulders because I was shaking so violently I could barely speak. The police arrived first. 2 state troopers in separate vehicles, their lights painting the desert in alternating flashes of red and blue. Then the ambulance arrived. Then more police. Then a detective in an unmarked sedan who introduced himself as Sergeant Philip Reeves. I told them everything I could remember. My voice sounded hollow and mechanical as I described the truck, the man, the false warning about the tire. They took photographs of the bruises on my neck, the scrapes on my palms from falling on the gravel, the shoe I was still clutching in my hands as if it were some kind of talisman. Someone placed a thermal blanket over my shoulders and took me to the back of an ambulance, where a paramedic checked my vital signs and shone a flashlight into my eyes. From there, I watched them cordon off the area around Nora's body. I watched them photograph the scene from every angle. I watched as finally they covered her with a white sheet that seemed to glow against the dark earth. I kept waiting to wake up. I kept waiting for that nightmare to end and to find myself back in our apartment, with Nora beside me complaining that I had stolen all the blankets again. But the cold was too real. The pain in my throat was too sharp. The image of her empty eyes had been carved too deeply into my memory. The investigation moved faster than I expected, although the days and weeks that followed are mostly a blurred mix of police stations, funeral arrangements, and phone calls I do not remember making. The pickup truck was found abandoned 2 days later at a rest stop near Santa Fe. It had been cleaned to remove fingerprints, but not well enough to erase everything. Forensic technicians recovered DNA from a cigarette butt in the ashtray and a partial print from the rearview mirror that the killer had not managed to clean. Both pieces of evidence matched a man named Boyd Driscoll, 44 years old, with a record of assault charges in 3 different states and an outstanding warrant in Texas for a similar attack against a couple near Amarillo 2 years earlier. That couple had survived barely because another driver stopped before Driscoll could finish what he had started. The FBI joined the case when they linked him to at least 2 other highway attacks in the Southwest. It was a pattern of violence targeting travelers on isolated stretches of road late at night. They found him 17 days after Nora's death, hiding in a mobile home park on the outskirts of Flagstaff, Arizona. He was living under a false name and doing cash jobs at a nearby ranch. He did not resist when they came to arrest him. According to the agents involved in the capture, he smiled when they read him his rights, as if the whole thing were some kind of game he had finally grown tired of. The trial was held in Albuquerque the following spring, and I sat in that courtroom every day for 3 straight weeks. Nora's sister sat beside me, squeezing my hand so hard she left marks, and together we listened as prosecutors presented the evidence one piece at a time. The DNA, the fingerprints, the testimony of the Texas couple who identified Driscoll as the man who had attacked them on a lonely road outside Amarillo. I had to testify, too. I had to sit on the witness stand and describe every detail of the worst night of my life, while Driscoll watched me from the defense table with that same empty expression I remembered from the highway. His attorney tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have been driving that truck, but the jury did not believe it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges, including first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and when they led him out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned his head and looked directly at me. He did not say anything. He did not smile. He only held my gaze for a long moment before the marshals pushed him through the door. I have seen that look in my dreams more times than I can count. Almost 2 years have passed now, and I still cannot drive at night without feeling my chest tighten and my breathing become shallow. I sold the Subaru, sold our apartment, and moved to a small town in Vermont, where Nora and I had always talked about retiring someday. Her sister writes to me every few days. She sends me pictures of her children who are growing up too fast, and reminds me that Nora would want me to keep living, even when living feels impossible. I go to therapy twice a week and take medication that helps me sleep without dreaming. Some days are better than others. Some days I almost manage to convince myself that I am healing, that the weight in my chest is becoming lighter, that someday I will be able to remember Nora without seeing her lying on that frozen ground, her eyes full of stars. But then I hear a horn sound unexpectedly, or I see a dark pickup truck in a parking lot, or I notice someone walking a little too close behind me, and everything comes rushing back as if it happened yesterday. I am sharing this because I need people to understand that these things happen to real people on ordinary nights, when all they are trying to do is get from one place to another. If someone signals for you to stop on an empty highway, do not pull over. Keep driving. Call 911 and let them check it out. Because those 5 minutes you might save by trying to be a good Samaritan can cost you everything you have ever loved. Story 2. Carla had been asleep for about an hour when everything changed. We were driving from Portland to Sacramento to attend her cousin's wedding, a long trip we had decided to do in one shot to save ourselves the cost of a motel. She and I graduated together from Oregon State in 2015, got married 2 years later, and between her shifts as a nurse and my work as an electrician, we almost never found time for road trips anymore. That Thursday morning, we left before dawn. We loaded the Subaru Outback with snacks and luggage and watched as the Pacific Northwest disappeared behind us while California opened up into golden hills. September had brought that kind of perfect weather where the sun warms everything without actually making you sweat. I drove with the window barely cracked open, listening to a true crime podcast, while Carla slept with her head resting against the glass. We had planned everything in detail: the rest stops, the charging cables, and a cooler full of sandwiches. For the first 6 hours, the trip felt almost peaceful, like a small vacation before the disorder of the wedding celebrations. We were somewhere past Redding, already inside that lonely corridor where gas stations become scarce and the landscape turns into dry brush and brown hills, when I saw the man on the shoulder. A silver pickup truck was stopped with the hood raised. Next to it stood a figure slowly waving his arms, almost tiredly, like someone who had been trying to get driver's attention for quite a while. I eased off the gas a little and Carla shifted in her seat, half waking up as she narrowed her eyes to look through the windshield at the scene ahead of us. The man looked fairly normal. He was wearing jeans, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a faded baseball cap pulled down over a graying beard. He might have been around 45, with that weathered face you often see on men who work outdoors. His truck had California plates, and at his feet there was a gym bag. Carla gave me a questioning look, one of those silent conversations married couples have, and I stopped about 50 feet ahead. It was broad daylight, my phone had service, and the guy really seemed to be stranded. When I lowered the window, he approached with an expression of relief and explained that his fuel pump had broken down, leaving him stuck there for almost 2 hours without anyone stopping to help him. He said his name was Greg, or at least that was what he told us. He mentioned that he was on his way to Stockton to visit his daughter, that he had been driving since morning, and that the truck had simply shut off without warning. His way of speaking was calm, even polite, with a slight southern accent that made him sound friendly. He asked us if we could take him to the next town where there was a mechanic, maybe about 20 or 30 miles ahead. Carla looked at me, and I could see her doing the calculations in her head. It was daytime. We were on a public highway. It was 2 against 1. I told Greg to grab his bag and get into the back seat. He thanked us over and over again, almost too much, and settled in behind Carla with the gym bag on his lap. As I merged back onto the interstate, I caught sight of him in the rear-view mirror. He was adjusting his cap and looking out the window. Nothing alarming, nothing strange. Just a man who had had bad luck with his vehicle, or at least that was what I convinced myself to believe at the time. The first 15 minutes passed without incident. Greg made light conversation about the weather, asked where we were headed, and mentioned that he used to work in construction until his back gave out. Carla, who has always been the more sociable one between us, asked him questions about his daughter, and he answered with vague details that seemed normal at the time. He said she was in college studying something related to computers, that she lived with her boyfriend in an apartment near downtown. He spoke slowly, carefully, and I noticed that he kept looking at my phone, which was mounted on the dashboard, watching the GPS map as it followed our route south. At some point, he asked how much farther it was to the next exit. When I told him about 12 miles, he nodded and fell silent. Carla glanced at me sideways in a way that told me she was paying attention too. The silence inside the car grew heavier, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, although I could not point to the exact moment when things had started to change. When we approached the exit for a small town called Cottonwood, I turned on the blinker to take the ramp. I thought it would be a good place to drop Greg off so he could find a mechanic or call a tow truck from there. But before I could move into the exit lane, his voice came from the back seat, sharper than before. "Keep going," he said. "That town is useless. Nothing is open on Thursdays." I looked at Carla, who had turned slightly in her seat to watch him. I told Greg that this was the exit he had asked for, the next town with services, but he shook his head and insisted that we continue to the next one. He said something about a friend who worked at a shop there, someone who would give him a good price. His tone had changed. The friendly accent had been replaced by something flatter, more insistent. I missed the exit and merged back into the flow of traffic. In the mirror, I saw Greg lean back in the seat again, his hands resting on the gym bag. Carla reached over and squeezed my knee. It was a silent message I understood completely. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Greg began giving directions without anyone asking him to. He told me which lane to stay in, pointed out approaching signs as if I could not read them on my own. When I mentioned that the GPS showed a rest stop ahead with gas stations and food, he immediately dismissed it, saying those places were tourist traps with exaggerated prices and that we should keep going. Now his voice had an edge to it. It was not openly threatening, but it was firm in a way that left no room for argument. Carla tried to ease the tension by offering him a bottle of water from our cooler, but he refused without even looking at her, his eyes fixed on the road. Then I noticed that his right hand had slipped inside the gym bag and was resting there casually. My mind started running through possibilities I did not want to consider. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town, with a stranger in the back seat who no longer seemed interested in being dropped off anywhere. I decided to test him. I announced that we needed gas, that the tank was getting low, and that I would have to stop at the next station, no matter what he thought about tourist traps. Greg leaned forward between the seats, close enough that I could smell the cigarette smoke embedded in his clothes, and looked at the fuel gauge on the dashboard. "You have enough for another 40 miles, he said in a low, steady voice. "Trust me, there's a better place up ahead. Cleaner bathrooms, cheaper gas. You'll thank me." The way he said it did not sound like a suggestion. Carla had gone rigid in her seat. Her hand was still on my knee, but now she was squeezing harder. I kept driving while my mind ran through options that all seemed to end badly. If I stopped and demanded that he get out, what would he do? What did he have inside that bag? The road stretched ahead of us, empty and endless. There were no other cars in sight, only brown hills and dry grass beneath a sky that suddenly seemed too large and too indifferent. I thought about my phone, about calling 911, but Greg was right there, watching everything, and I could not risk making him feel cornered. Then he started talking about his life without us asking, in a way that felt like a warning disguised as conversation. He casually mentioned that he had been in prison, as if he were talking about the weather. He said he had made mistakes when he was younger, that he had fallen in with the wrong people, that he had spent a few years in an institution up north. "People judge you by your past," he said, looking at the back of Carla's head. They see a record and think they know who you are. But sometimes a man just needs a chance, you know? Sometimes he just needs people to help him get where he's going without asking too many questions. Carla nodded slowly without turning around, and I could see her chest rising and falling faster than normal. I murmured something that sounded like agreement, playing along, trying to buy time. Greg smiled at that. It was a brief flash of teeth in the rearview mirror. Then he patted the gym bag on his lap as if it were a pet. "You two seem like good people," he continued. "Smart people. The kind who understand that some situations are better handled calmly." I felt sweat forming on my palms, even though the air conditioning was blowing cold, and I understood, with horrible clarity, that we were completely at his mercy. We had been driving another 15 minutes when I saw something ahead that changed everything. Red and blue lights were flashing in the distance. There was a group of patrol cars parked on the side of the road, with officers outside, organizing what appeared to be a checkpoint. My heart jumped and I saw Carla sit up a little straighter, hope crossing her face for the first time in nearly an hour. But Greg saw it too. He cursed under his breath and leaned forward again. Now his hand was completely inside the gym bag, gripping something I could not see. "Take the next exit," he hissed in a completely different voice, with no trace left of the fake friendliness. "Do it now before we get any closer." I looked at the GPS and saw that an exit was coming up in half a mile. It was a rural route leading toward empty fields, with no towns marked for several miles. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I weighed my options. If I took the exit, we would be alone with him on a deserted road, with no witnesses. If I kept driving toward the checkpoint, I had no idea what he would do, or what he would pull out of that bag in a moment of desperation. Carla made the decision for me. She pointed at the dashboard and said loudly enough for Greg to hear that the engine temperature was rising too much and that we had to stop immediately, or we risked blowing the radiator. It was a lie. The gauge was normal, but she said it with such convincing panic that it worked. I understood instantly what she was doing. I turned on the hazard lights and began slowing down, moving toward the shoulder about a quarter mile before the checkpoint. Close enough for the officers to see us, but far enough for Greg to believe he still had a chance to escape. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. I told him the car was overheating, that I had no choice, that we would be stranded on the highway if I did not stop. He looked at the police lights ahead, then at the open fields beside us, calculating his alternatives. For one long and terrible moment, I thought he was going to do something violent. I could feel it in the air, like the electricity that builds before a storm breaks. Carla was pressed against her door, ready to jump out as soon as the car stopped. I had already decided that I would throw myself at him if he made any move toward her. The car stopped on the gravel shoulder, and for 3 seconds no one moved. Greg looked at the police lights. Then he looked at us. Then he turned his gaze back toward the open field stretching to a line of trees about 200 yards away. I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel, trying to seem as non-threatening as possible, giving him no reason to escalate the violence. "Stay in the car," he said in a low voice, almost to himself. Then he grabbed his gym bag and opened the rear door. At first, he did not run. He walked fast but with purpose, moving away from the road toward the line of trees without looking back. Carla grabbed my arm and we both stayed frozen, watching him leave. Neither of us dared to move until he was far enough away. When he reached the edge of the field, maybe about 50 yards away, he finally started jogging and disappeared into the brush. I let out the air as if it were the first time I had breathed in an hour. Carla was shaking beside me, her face pale, and I awkwardly hugged her over the center console. We sat there for a minute, just breathing, just being alive, together and safe. A few minutes later, one of the officers from the checkpoint approached our car. She was a tall woman with a calm manner, and she asked if we were having car trouble. I told her the truth, that we had picked up a hitchhiker, that he had become threatening, and that he had just run off into the field. Her expression changed immediately. She radioed her fellow officers while asking us for a description. We told her everything we could remember: the flannel shirt, the baseball cap, the gym bag. the silver pickup with California plates abandoned near Redding. She listened carefully, taking notes, and then told us something that made my whole body go cold. They were looking for someone matching that description in connection with an armed robbery that had happened 2 counties north, a gas station robbery in which the clerk had been brutally beaten. The man had stolen a truck to escape, and the last time he was seen, he was heading south on that same highway. We had spent more than an hour driving with someone capable of real violence sitting 3 feet behind my wife. The officer took our contact information and told us they might call us as witnesses. Then she allowed us to continue on our way. Carla and I did not speak for the next 50 miles. We only held hands over the console with the radio off. The only sound was the hum of the engine carrying us towards Sacramento and away from the worst day of our lives. Story 3. Corey swore he could drive through anything, and we were foolish enough to believe him. It was March 2023, spring break, and our small group had been on the road for almost 9 hours. I was in the passenger seat. Corey was behind the wheel of his dad's old Suburban. His girlfriend Megan was in the middle row, and Dante and Leia were squeezed in the back with all our bags. We had graduated together the year before, class of 2022, and that trip to Austin was supposed to be our big farewell before adulthood started pulling us apart. The plan at the time seemed brilliant. Drive all night, skip the motel, and save ourselves $100. The weather started getting ugly somewhere after crossing the Texas-Oklahoma border. But Corey just turned up the radio, and Dante opened a bottle of whiskey he had snuck out of his older brother's cabinet. When the bottle reached me, I took a drink, felt the burn go down my throat, and laughed at some stupid joke. We were young, we were together, and the storm outside seemed like nothing more than background noise for our little adventure. The rain intensified near midnight. I was sitting in the front passenger seat, watching the windshield wipers struggle to keep up with the water. The road we were on, some state highway whose number I do not even remember anymore, was completely dark except for our headlights. There were no street lights, no other cars, just endless darkness on both sides. By that point, Corey had been driving for almost 5 hours, and I noticed his eyes starting to close. He kept rubbing his face over and over and rolling down the window so the cold air would hit him in the face. Megan suggested we stop somewhere and rest for a few hours, but Corey brushed it off with a gesture. He said we were only 3 hours away, that stopping now would be stupid when we were already so close. Dante laughed from the back and made some joke about Corey being weak. And that was when Corey took the bottle of whiskey and drank a long pull just to prove something. I should have said something. I should have taken the wheel from him or demanded that we stop. But I just sat there, watching the rain hit the glass, telling myself everything would be fine. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Leia fell asleep against the window in the back. Megan had also dozed off, her head resting on a rolled-up jacket. Dante was checking his phone, and the blue light from the screen gave his face a ghostly look in the darkness. I remember feeling my own eyelids grow heavy, that dangerous pull of sleep when you have been awake too long. The heater was turned all the way up, the inside of the vehicle was warm, and the sound of the rain had become a steady white noise that made everything feel unreal, like a dream. I pinched my arm several times to stay alert. I kept watching Corey. He was blinking too much, that rapid flutter people do when they are fighting not to fall asleep. I asked him if he wanted me to take the wheel, told him I could drive the rest of the way. He shook his head, said he was fine, that we were almost there. The GPS showed 2 hours and 40 minutes remaining. I remember that number exactly because I stared at it, wondering if we were really going to make it. The curve appeared out of nowhere. 1 second we were on a straight stretch of road, and the next the road was turning sharply left. I think there was a yellow warning sign, but the rain was falling so hard that Corey did not see it until we were already on top of it. He jerked the wheel, overcorrected, and suddenly the Suburban started sliding sideways across the wet asphalt. I heard Megan scream behind me. It was a sharp tearing sound that cut through everything else. The tires let out a horrible screech as Corey tried to regain control, pumping the brakes the way you are not supposed to on a slippery road. Time stretched in that strange way it does during a crisis. I could see every raindrop frozen in the light from the headlights. I could feel my body pressing against the seatbelt as we spun. Then we slammed into the guardrail on the right side of the road, and the impact threw me forward so hard I thought my chest was going to cave in. The car did not stop at the guardrail. We went through it or over it. I still do not know which one happened. All I remember is the feeling of falling, that nauseating emptiness in my stomach when the Suburban went completely off the road. We rolled at least twice, maybe 3 times. Glass exploded everywhere. I heard Dante shout something. I heard metal crushing and twisting around us. My head hit the window, the dashboard. Something hard that split my forehead open. Everything was movement, spinning, chaos of sounds, pain and absolute terror. When the vehicle finally stopped moving, we were upside down in a ditch. The engine was still running, and the headlights illuminated nothing but mud and broken branches. I was hanging from the seatbelt, with blood dripping from my face onto the roof that was now beneath me. For a few seconds, I could hear nothing except a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The first thing I perceived when that ringing began to fade was Megan crying. She was not screaming anymore. She was only letting out broken, choked sobs, as if she could not get her breath back. I called out to Corey, but he did not answer. His body was tilted forward, held by the seatbelt, his arms hanging limply toward the crushed roof beneath us. I could see blood on his face, a lot of it, but I could not tell where it was coming from. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely find the buckle of my seatbelt. I pressed the button again and again, but it was stuck, bent, or something like that. The rain was still pounding outside, coming in through the broken windows, mixing with the blood on my face. I finally managed to release the belt and fell hard onto the roof, landing on broken glass and pieces of plastic from the dashboard. Then I felt the pain in my shoulder, a burning, stabbing sensation that made me want to vomit. I think I dislocated it in the crash, though I did not know that yet. All I knew was that something was very wrong with my left arm. I crawled toward Corey first because he was closest. The entire front of the vehicle was caved in. The steering wheel was pressing against his chest in a way that froze my heart. I took his face in my hands, slapped his cheek lightly, and repeated his name as if that could make him wake up. His eyes were closed and there was a deep wound running from his hairline to his eyebrow. Blood was coming out in a steady, pulsing rhythm that scared me more than anything else. But he was breathing. I could see his chest rise and fall in small, shallow movements. Behind me, I heard Dante groaning and Laia calling for help, her voice high and terrified. Megan had stopped crying and gone silent, which was almost worse. I did not know what to do. I did not know who to help first. We were in the middle of nowhere, upside down in a ditch, and none of us knew if help was coming or if we were simply going to bleed out there in the darkness. Dante managed to kick out the rear window. I heard the glass give way, and then I saw him crawl into the mud, moving on his elbows because something was wrong with his legs. He was cursing the whole time, a constant stream of words I could barely make out through the rain. I turned to check on Megan, and that was when I saw her arm. It was bent at an angle arms do not bend. The bone was pushing against the skin as if it were about to break through. She was conscious, but her eyes had a glassy, distant look, as if her brain had shut down to protect her from the pain. Somehow Laia was the least injured. From what I could see, she only had cuts and bruises. She got out after Dante and immediately started screaming for help into the darkness. Her voice was swallowed by the storm. I stayed with Corey and Megan, trying to keep them awake, talking to them about anything I could think of. I talked to Corey about that time freshman year when we skipped class to go fishing. I talked to Megan about how Corey had said he wanted to propose to her once they both got jobs. Stupid, desperate things, anything to keep them with me. My phone was destroyed. The screen had cracked into a spider web of broken glass. Dante's phone had flown out of his hand during the accident, and we never found it. But Laia still had hers, somehow tucked inside the pocket of her jacket. She called 911 and tried to explain where we were, but none of us knew. We were on a state highway heading south toward Austin, but we did not remember which one or how far we had gone. The operator kept asking for landmarks, mile markers, anything that could help them find us. All Leia could say was that we were in a ditch, that it was dark, that her friends were dying. That last word hit me like a punch to the chest. Dying. I had not allowed myself to think it until she said it out loud. The operator told her to stay on the line. She said they would try to trace the call. She told us to keep everyone as still as possible. The rain kept falling and the minutes stretched until they felt like hours. I held Corey's hand and watched his chest rise and fall, counting each breath as if it might be the last. It took the ambulance 47 minutes to find us. I know because Leia's phone showed the length of the call when they finally arrived. 47 minutes sitting in the rain and darkness, watching my best friend slip in and out of consciousness. At some point, Megan started shaking uncontrollably. Her whole body trembled, even though it was not even that cold. Shock, I know now. Her body was shutting down. Dante had dragged himself to a tree and was leaning against it. His face was pale, and his lips were starting to turn a shade of blue that terrified me. When I finally saw the flashing lights up on the road, I started crying. They were not quiet tears, but ugly, violent sobs, the kind that come from the deepest part of your chest. The paramedics had to descend with ropes into the ditch because it was too steep to bring a stretcher down. They put a neck brace on Corey, secured him to a backboard, and it took 4 of them to get him back up to the road. I refused to leave until everyone else was out. I stayed there standing in the mud, with my shoulder dislocated and my head bleeding, watching them pull my friends out of that hole one by one. The hospital is a blurred mix of fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, and people asking me questions I could not answer. They put my shoulder back into place without warning me. I screamed so loudly that a nurse came running from the hallway. They gave me 13 stitches in my forehead. I had a concussion and 2 cracked ribs I did not even know I had broken. But I was the lucky one. Dante had shattered both kneecaps and needed surgery that same night. Megan's arm was broken in 3 places, and she had internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. Leia had a fractured collarbone and whiplash so severe she could not turn her head for weeks. And Corey, the same one who had sworn he could drive through anything, was in a medically induced coma for 4 days. Traumatic brain injury, they said. Swelling inside the skull. They had to drill a hole to relieve the pressure. His parents flew in from Michigan, and his mother grabbed me by the shoulders in the waiting room, asking me what had happened, asking me why we did not stop, asking me the same questions I have repeated to myself every day since then. Corey woke up on the 5th day. He did not remember the accident. He did not remember the curve, or the rain, or the guardrail. The last thing he remembered was crossing the Texas border and Dante passing him the bottle of whiskey. The doctor said it was normal, that the brain protects itself by erasing trauma. I wished my brain could do the same, but instead I remember everything. The sound of Megan screaming, the feeling of the vehicle lifting off the ground, the smell of blood and gasoline mixing with the rain. Corey spent 3 weeks in the hospital and another 2 months in physical therapy, learning to walk in a straight line again. Dante still walks with a limp and probably always will. Megan never fully regained movement in her arm. She and Corey broke up about 6 months after the accident. It was not because of a fight, but because every time she looked at him, she saw that night. That was what she told Leia. Some things simply break in a way that cannot be repaired. Almost 2 years have passed, and I still cannot drive at night. As soon as the sun goes down and I am behind the wheel, I feel my chest tighten, my vision start to close in, and I have to pull over before I have a full panic attack. I take medication for it. I go to therapy every 2 weeks. I do all the things you are supposed to do. But some nights I still wake up at exactly 1:47 in the morning, the time the accident happened according to the police report. And I am back in that ditch hanging upside down, with blood in my eyes, with Corey not answering when I say his name. The 5 of us barely talk anymore, not because anyone is angry, but because being together means remembering. It means looking at Dante's limp, or Megan's stiff arm, or the scar on my forehead, and reliving the worst night of our lives. We saved $100 by not stopping at that motel. We saved $100, and it cost us everything else. I am telling this story now because I need someone to understand that it can happen to you too. One bad decision, one moment of believing you are invincible, and suddenly you are upside down in the dark, wondering if you are going to die. Stop. Pay for the motel. It is not worth it. Nothing is worth it. Story 4. Patty and I had been married for 41 years when we finally decided to take that coast-to-coast trip we had been postponing ever since our youngest son graduated from college in 2008. I had retired from the Postal Service 2 years earlier, and she had just finished her last semester teaching 4th grade at Ridgemont Elementary School. Our granddaughter Ellie was about to turn 5 in Arizona, and our son Craig kept insisting that we make the trip by road instead of taking a plane. He wanted us to experience the open road, to see the landscapes we had only talked about for decades around the dinner table. So we bought a used motorhome, a 2014 Winnebago Adventurer that, despite its faded exterior, still had a solid structure. We spent 3 weeks preparing it for the trip, checking every seal, every hose, and every belt. Patty chose new curtains, pale blue with tiny white flowers, and I installed a better radio system so we could listen to her audiobooks during the long drives. We mapped out our road carefully, planning stops at national parks and small restaurants with good reviews online. We left Cedar Falls, Iowa, on a Saturday morning in late September, on one of those days when the air smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves. Patty made egg sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil for breakfast, and I filled 2 thermoses with black coffee. Our neighbors Harold and Deb Winslow waved to us from their porch as we pulled out of the driveway. The motorhome groaned slightly under the weight of everything we had packed. Behind us, we were towing our old Subaru Outback, thinking we would need a smaller vehicle once we got to Craig's house for short trips and errands. The first 2 days went exactly as we had planned. The first night we stopped at a campground near Omaha, grilled hamburgers on our small portable stove, and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Patty fell asleep reading her mystery novel while I stayed awake listening to the crickets and feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. I remember thinking that this was exactly what retirement was supposed to feel like. I had no idea that in less than 72 hours, everything would break and turn into something I still cannot fully explain. By the 3rd day, we had crossed into Colorado and were driving through some of the most isolated stretches of road I had ever seen in my life. The landscape changed from flat farmland to rugged hills scattered with brush and red rock formations. The cell signal started failing around noon, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon we had no signal at all. Patty kept checking her phone because she wanted to send pictures to Craig, but eventually she gave up and simply started taking photos to send later. We stopped for gas at a small station outside a town called Elwood Springs, with a population of maybe 300 people, according to a faded sign. The station was one of those old ones, with only 2 pumps and a little convenience store attached to the side. A man came out to help us, which surprised me because I had not seen a full-service gas station in years. He was tall and thin, maybe in his 50s, with deep lines carved into his face by the sun and a worn denim jacket despite the heat. His name tag said Roy. He smiled at us in a way that seemed friendly enough, though his eyes lingered on our motorhome and the Subaru being towed behind it a little longer than usual. Roy asked where we were headed, and I told him Arizona to visit family. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands with a rag that looked like it had never been clean. He mentioned that the route we were taking, Highway 84 through the Canyon Pass, had been having some problems lately. When I asked what kind of problems, he only shrugged and said that some people had reported vehicle trouble in that area, breakdowns in places where tow trucks took hours to arrive. He suggested we take the longer route through Millbrook. That would add maybe 2 hours to the trip, but it would keep us on more traveled roads. Patty and I exchanged a glance. We had chosen that route specifically for the panoramic views of the canyon, and 2 extra hours meant arriving at Craig's house late into the night. I thanked Roy for the advice, but told him we would stick with our original plan. He did not insist. He only handed me the receipt and told us to be careful out there. As we drove away, I saw him in the side mirror. He He was still standing beside the pumps, watching us until we disappeared around the curve. Patty commented that he seemed nice, though a little strange. I agreed, although something about that encounter stayed uncomfortable in my chest. A feeling I pushed aside because I did not want to ruin the mood of the trip. Highway 84 wound through the canyon like a gray ribbon laid over ancient bones. The rock walls rose on both sides, marked by layers of orange, brown, and deep purple where the shadows gathered. Patty had the window down and took photos every few minutes, marveling at formations that looked like castles or sleeping giants, depending on how the light hit them. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel more tightly than usual as we took the curves. We had not seen another car in more than an hour. The motorhome was handling fairly well, but towing the Subaru made everything feel heavier, slower. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I noticed a white pickup truck in the rearview mirror. At first, it stayed far behind, barely a dot against the canyon walls. But over the next 20 minutes, it gradually closed the distance until it was maybe about 50 yards behind us. I could not see the driver clearly because of the glare on the windshield, only a dark silhouette behind the wheel. Patty noticed me checking the mirror and turned to look. She said it was probably just another person crossing the canyon, that there was nothing to worry about. I nodded, but I kept watching. The pickup stayed behind us for another 30 minutes, without trying to pass even when the road widened enough to allow it. If I slowed down, it slowed down too. If I sped up a little, it matched my pace exactly. Patty stopped taking pictures and started watching the truck too. Her earlier joy faded into something more cautious. I suggested we stop at the next viewpoint to let it pass, even if only to calm myself down. She agreed quietly. About 10 minutes later, we reached a small gravel turnout with a wooden sign identifying it as Canyon Ridge Viewpoint. I pulled the motorhome off the road and stopped, expecting the white pickup to keep going and disappear around the next curve. But instead, it slowed down as it approached, almost to a crawl, and I got my first clear view of the driver. He was a younger man, maybe around 35, with a shaved head and a thick beard that covered much of his face. He was wearing dark sunglasses, even though the sun was already starting to sink behind the canyon walls. He looked directly at us as he passed, turning his head to keep us in sight, and I saw his lips move as if he were saying something, or maybe counting. Then he accelerated and disappeared around the curve. Patty grabbed my arm and asked if I had seen that, if I had seen the way he looked at us. I told her yes, I had seen it. We sat there in silence for a long moment, with the engine running and the wind whistling through the canyon like a low moan. I wanted to turn around. I told Patty we should go back to Elwood Springs, find a place to stay that night, and take the alternate route the next morning. But she pointed out that we had already driven more than an hour into the canyon, and turning back would mean losing almost all the daylight we had left. The map showed a tiny town called Hadley about 45 minutes ahead, and she suggested we continue there and stop at that place. Logically, it made sense. I told myself the man in the pickup was probably just a local curious about out-of-state plates. People in isolated areas notice strangers. It did not have to mean anything sinister. So I put the motorhome back in gear and returned to the road, checking the mirrors constantly, scanning the road ahead of us for any sign of that white truck. For the next 20 minutes, the drive was quiet. The canyon walls began to lower as we climbed, and patches of pine forest started to appear on the slopes. Patty relaxed a little and commented on how beautiful the trees looked in the golden afternoon light. I allowed myself to breathe again, too. Maybe we had overreacted. Maybe that man was just odd. Nothing more. Then we rounded a sharp curve, and I had to slam on the brakes so hard that Patty lurched forward against the seatbelt, and our coffee thermos flew off the dashboard onto the floor. The white pickup was sideways across the road, completely blocking both lanes. The driver was standing in front of it, his arms crossed over his chest, watching us approach. He had taken off the dark sunglasses, and even from 50 feet away I could see that his eyes were pale, almost colorless, like dirty ice. Behind him, 2 other men emerged from the tree line on the right side of the road. One was short and stocky, wearing a camouflage jacket and holding something in his right hand that I could not identify at first. The other was taller, thinner, with long greasy hair tied back in a ponytail and a cigarette hanging from his lips. They walked slowly toward the pickup, positioning themselves on either side of the bald man. All three of them looked at our motorhome with expressions that held no friendliness or curiosity, only a kind of flat anticipation. Patty whispered my name, her voice tight and thin. I put the motorhome in reverse, my foot already pressing the accelerator. But before I could move more than a few feet, I heard another engine behind us. I looked in the side mirror and saw a rusty brown sedan pulling up to block our retreat. It stopped about 20 yards behind us. A fourth man got out, older than the others, with several days of gray stubble and a hunting rifle resting casually against his shoulder. We were completely trapped, caught on a stretch of canyon road with rock walls on one side, thick forest on the other, and men who had clearly been waiting for us. Patty begged me to do something, anything. But my mind went blank with a kind of terror I had never felt before. 41 years of marriage, 2 children raised, an entire life built on routines and certainties, and none of it had prepared me for that moment. The bald man began walking toward us. His boots crunched over the gravel. He motioned for me to lower the window. I did not move. He stopped about 10 feet from my door and tilted his head as if he were studying an animal inside a cage. Then he spoke. His voice was calm and almost kind. He told me we could do this the easy way or the hard way, and that doing it the easy way meant getting out of the vehicle with our hands visible and cooperating. He said they would not hurt us if we behaved, that they only wanted the motorhome and whatever cash we had, and that afterward they would let us walk to Hadley. I wanted to believe him. A part of me was desperate to believe this was only a robbery, that we would lose our belongings but keep our lives. But I looked at the other men. I looked at their faces. I looked at the way the stocky one kept tapping whatever he was holding against his thigh. And I knew, deep down, that they had no intention of letting us walk anywhere. Patty knew it too. She reached over and squeezed my hand so hard I felt her rings digging into my skin. In that instant, I made a decision that still haunts me. I told Patty to hold on. Then I slammed the accelerator in reverse, aiming directly at the brown sedan blocking us from behind. The older man jumped aside, dropping the rifle, and I heard the sickening crunch of metal when the Subaru we were towing crashed into the front of the sedan. The impact shook us hard, and I heard glass breaking somewhere behind me, but the sedan swung sideways enough to open a gap on the left side of the road. I put the motorhome in drive and turned the wheel hard. The tires screamed against the asphalt as I tried to squeeze through the space. The bald man lunged toward my window. His fist struck the glass, leaving a spiderweb crack right in my field of vision. The stocky man ran alongside us, and I finally saw what he was carrying: a crowbar. He slammed it into the side panel of the motorhome with a sound like thunder. But we were already moving. We were gaining speed. I kept my foot pressed all the way down while the motorhome swayed and trembled from the damage. In the mirror, I saw the men running back to their vehicles, and I knew we had only bought a few minutes at most. Patty was crying. She asked if I was okay, asked what we were going to do, and I had no answers. All I could do was drive. The motorhome was suffering. Whatever damage had been caused by the collision, I could feel it in the way the steering wheel pulled hard to the right, and the engine was making a rough noise that had not been there before. The Subaru behind us was dragging badly. One of the front tires had burst and was scraping against the pavement, throwing a shower of sparks. I knew we would not be able to keep going like this for long. Patty checked her phone again, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. The road climbed higher, twisting now through dense pine forest, with the canyon walls far behind us. I checked the mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see headlights, but the road behind us remained dark. Maybe we had damaged their vehicles enough to slow them down. Maybe they had given up. I did not believe either possibility, but I allowed myself to cling to hope. About 15 minutes later, the motorhome began shaking violently, and a terrible burning smell filled the cabin. Patty pointed at the temperature gauge, which had climbed all the way into the red. The radiator must have been damaged in the collision. I had no choice but to stop before the engine melted down completely. I found a dirt road branching off the highway, partially hidden by overgrown brush. I turned onto it and drove about a quarter mile until we were out of sight of the main road. Then I shut off the engine. We sat in that sudden silence, listening to the ticking of hot metal and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. I told Patty we would have to abandon the motorhome and continue on foot in the darkness. Maybe we would have a chance to hide until morning, and then we could find our way to Hadley or flag down some passing vehicle. She did not argue. We took what we could carry quickly: water bottles, a flashlight, her phone, even though it was useless, and my wallet with our cash and cards. I thought about the Subaru, but one look at its destroyed front end told me it was not going anywhere. When we stepped down from the motorhome, the forest around us felt immense and alive. Every crackle of leaves made my heart pound in my chest. We started walking deeper into the trees away from the dirt road, trying to move silently through the brush. Patty held my hand so tightly that I could feel her racing pulse against my palm. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, tripping over roots and rocks in the fading light, until we found a small depression with a rocky overhang that offered some cover. We crawled underneath it and pressed ourselves against the cold stone, barely breathing, waiting. Darkness fell quickly, swallowing the forest in shades of black and gray. Then, from somewhere toward the road, I heard engines. More than one. They had found us, or at least they had found the point where we turned off. Patty buried her face against my shoulder to muffle any sound, and I wrapped my arms around her, feeling her entire body tremble. Headlights flickered through the trees in the distance, moving back and forth like searchlights. I heard men's voices calling to one another, though I could not make out the words. We stayed under that overhang for hours. I do not know exactly how long, because in the darkness time stopped making sense. At some point the voices faded and the headlights disappeared, but neither of us dared to move. Patty fell into a kind of restless sleep against my chest, letting out small whimpers every few minutes, and I stayed awake, watching the shadows for any movement. My legs cramped. My back hurt from being pressed against the rock. Mosquitoes found us and bit every inch of exposed skin, but I did not swat them away because even that small movement felt too risky. Around what I guessed was 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning, I saw an orange glow rising above the tree line, in the direction where we had left the motorhome. It flickered and grew brighter. Soon I could smell smoke drifting through the forest. They were burning it. They were destroying any evidence of what they had tried to do to us. Or maybe they were only taking out their rage on our belongings because they had not managed to find us. I held Patty tighter and watched the glow pulse against the sky until it began to fade with the first gray light of dawn. When the sun rose enough for us to see clearly, we crawled out of our hiding place, stiff, exhausted, covered in dirt and bug bites. We started walking east, in the direction where I thought the road had to be, moving slowly and stopping every few minutes to listen for any sound of pursuit. It took us almost 4 hours to reach a paved road, and another hour walking along the shoulder before a truck driver saw us and stopped. His name was Glenn Barker, and he was hauling lumber toward Phoenix. He took one look at us, dirty, scratched, and clearly terrified, and told us to get in without asking questions. He drove us straight to the sheriff's station in Hadley. From there, everything became a blurred mix of statements, interviews, and calls to Craig, who drove through the night to be with us. The police found our motorhome 2 days later, burned down to nothing but the frame in the place where we had abandoned it. The Subaru was discovered about 6 miles farther away, without plates and stripped of anything valuable, abandoned beside a forest road. They arrested a man named Wesley Grubb 3 weeks later. He was the bald man with the pale eyes. They caught him after he tried to use the same plan on another couple passing through the area. He had a record going back 20 years: armed robbery, assault, auto theft. He was also linked to at least 2 other disappearances in that region, cases where the victims were never found. The other men scattered and were never identified, at least not that the police ever told us. Wesley never confessed to anything. He never explained what they planned to do with us if we had cooperated that day on the canyon road. I think about that sometimes, late at night, when Patty is sleeping beside me and the house is quiet. I think about what would have happened if I had not slammed on that accelerator in reverse. If I had believed his lie that they would let us walk to Hadley, we would have been 2 more names on a list of people who disappeared on a lonely stretch of road, and our son would have spent the rest of his life wondering what happened to his parents. We never took another road trip after that. The Winnebago was gone, and neither of us had any desire to replace it. There are roads that are not meant to be traveled, and memories that cannot be left behind no matter how far you drive. Story 5. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, my friend Grant and I were about 6 hours into what was supposed to be a 12-hour drive from Denver to Kansas City. We had left after he finished his shift at the warehouse, thinking we could take turns driving and arrive by noon the next day. Neither of us had slept much the night before, him because of work and me because I could not stop thinking about seeing my dad in the hospital. Grant was behind the wheel when he started drifting just slightly toward the shoulder. I told him to pull over before he got us both killed. We had passed the last real rest stop maybe 40 miles back, but ahead of us, on the right side of the road, a small exit appeared. There was no sign, no lights, just an open gravel clearing among the trees. Grant pulled in and parked near the edge where the gravel met the grass. The plan was simple: sleep for 2 or 3 hours, and then continue on. We both got out to stretch. The air was cold for September, the kind of cold that slips inside your jacket and stays against your skin. Grant walked toward the tree line to pee, while I circled the car, trying to work the stiffness out of my legs after sitting for so long. Our headlights were still on, casting 2 pale beams of light into the darkness in front of us. That was when I noticed the ground right there, maybe about 20 feet in front of the car. The gravel had been disturbed. There were recent tire tracks, deep ones, as if someone had peeled out at high speed. The dirt beside them was disturbed too, piled unevenly. I remember thinking it looked wrong, as if someone had been digging or dragging something heavy. I called Grant and told him to come look. He finished, zipped up, and came over. The 2 of us stood there, staring at the ground, trying to understand what it was. Grant took out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The light was weak, but it was enough to show us more than we wanted to see. The tire tracks were recent. I mean, really recent. The edges of the grooves were still defined, not worn down by wind or rain. Whoever had made them had been there within the last hour, maybe less. We followed the tracks with the light and saw that they turned sharply toward the tree line before disappearing into the grass. Then I smelled it. At first it was faint, a sweet and chemical mix, like gasoline combined with something else I could not identify. Grant smelled it too because he stopped moving and stood still with the phone pointed at the ground. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. We were both thinking the same thing, but neither of us wanted to be the one to say it out loud. I took the phone from his hand and walked a few more steps toward where the smell seemed to be coming from. About 10 feet from the edge of the gravel, half hidden in the tall grass, I found a pair of gloves. They were disposable, latex or nitrile, the kind doctors use. One of them was inside out, as if someone had pulled it off in a hurry. I crouched down to look at it more closely, and then I saw the jacket. It was maybe 5 feet farther into the grass, crumpled as if someone had thrown it there. It was dark-colored, seemed like denim or maybe canvas. I moved the flashlight beam over it, and my stomach turned. There was a stain on the back. A large, dark, wet-looking stain. I had never seen that much blood on anything in my life, not even in movies where they always exaggerate everything. This was real. The fabric was soaked in some places, and there were smeared stains leading away from the jacket, deeper into the brush. Drag marks. Someone had been dragged from that spot into the woods. I stood up so quickly I almost lost my balance. Grant was right behind me looking over my shoulder, and I heard him whisper something under his breath. A curse, a prayer I do not know. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to find some innocent explanation that would make all of it okay. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe some hunters had been there and had field-dressed a deer or something like that. But hunters do not use latex gloves. Hunters do not abandon jackets soaked in blood. and those drag marks were wide, too wide to be from an animal. The grass was flattened in a path that had clearly been made by something the size of a person being pulled through it. I turned off the flashlight and grabbed Grant by the arm. "We have to leave," I told him. "Right now." He did not argue. We both started walking back toward the car, trying not to run, trying not to make noise. Every sound seemed amplified in that darkness. Our steps on the gravel, our breathing, the rustle of wind through the trees. I expected to hear something else at any moment. Footsteps that were not ours. A voice. Something. We were maybe 15 feet from the car when Grant stopped walking. He grabbed my shoulder and squeezed hard, saying nothing, only pointing. I followed the direction of his finger toward the tree line on the opposite side of the rest area, the part we had not explored. There was a light, weak, yellowish, barely visible between the branches. It looked like the beam of a flashlight, but it was not moving. It was simply there, pointed in our direction. I could not tell how far away it was. 50 feet? 100? The trees made it impossible to judge the distance. We froze, staring at that light, waiting to see if it moved. It did not. But then it turned off. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. The darkness that replaced it somehow felt heavier. Grant and I looked at each other. Even in the faint glow of the headlights, I could see the fear on his face. Without saying a word, we both ran to the car. I reached the passenger side and yanked the door open while Grant struggled with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put on my seatbelt. Grant dropped the keys once, picked them up, dropped them again. I wanted to yell at him to hurry, but I could not find my voice. Finally, he managed to get the key into the ignition, and the engine started. He put the car in reverse and we shot backward, kicking gravel everywhere. The tires spun for a second before catching the ground. I turned in my seat to look through the rear window. And that was when I saw the figure. A person was simply standing at the edge of the tree line, exactly where that light had been. I could not make out any features, only a silhouette dark against an even deeper darkness watching us leave. Grant must have seen it too in the rearview mirror, because he said something I will not repeat and slammed the accelerator to the floor. We entered the road too fast. The back of the car fishtailed before he managed to control it. Neither of us looked back again. For the first 10 minutes, we drove in silence. I kept checking the side mirror, expecting to see headlights behind us, expecting someone to be following us. The road was empty. It was only us, the broken yellow line, and the black wall of trees on both sides. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Grant's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his jaw was clenched. I wanted to say something, anything to break the tension, but every time I opened my mouth, nothing came out. What are you supposed to say after something like that? We had just found evidence of what looked like a murder, an assault, or something terrible. And there was someone in those trees who had seen us find it. Someone who watched us discover what he had done. I kept thinking about that light turning off. Whoever was holding it made a decision in that moment. He could have stayed hidden, could have waited for us to leave, but he wanted us to know he was there. He wanted us to see him watching us. About 30 miles later, we found a gas station that was still open. It was one of those 24-hour places, with buzzing fluorescent lights overhead and a bored guy behind the counter. We pulled into the parking lot and sat there for a minute. The engine was still running. Neither of us wanted to get out. Grant finally turned to me and asked what we should do. "Call the police," I said. "Obviously, we have to call the police." But even as I said it, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. What were we going to tell them? We found some gloves and a bloody jacket at an unmarked rest area somewhere along the road. We did not even know exactly where we had been. There were no signs, and I did not remember mile markers. Nothing that identified that exit. I opened maps on my phone and tried to retrace the route we had taken, but every stretch of that road looked the same. Trees, road. Grant suggested we keep driving, get to Kansas City, and forget about the whole thing. I told him we could not do that. If someone was hurt back there, if someone was dying in those woods while we sat there arguing, we had to do something. I called 911 from the gas station parking lot. The operator sounded tired, as if she had already taken 100 calls that night, and mine was just one more. I tried to explain what we had found: the tire tracks, the smell, the gloves, the jacket with blood, the drag marks. She asked for the location, and I told her I did not know exactly. Somewhere between mile markers 80 and 120 on the road going east from Denver. It was the best I could offer. She asked if we had touched anything, and I said no, which was true. She asked if we had seen anyone, and that was where I hesitated. I told her about the light between the trees, about the figure standing there when we left. There was a pause on the line. She asked me to describe the figure, and I told her I could not. It was too dark. I only saw a silhouette. She told me to stay on the line while she contacted the state patrol. Grant and I sat in that parking lot for almost an hour, waiting for someone to call us back. When they finally did, it was a state trooper. He said they were sending units to check the area, but that it might take them some time to locate the exact site. We arrived in Kansas City around noon the next day. I spent 3 days in the hospital with my dad, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. Grant stayed with a cousin of his in the city. We texted each other, but we did not really talk about what had happened. It was as if we had made a silent agreement to pretend it had only been a nightmare. On the 4th day, I received a call from a detective with the state patrol. He told me they had found the rest area we had described. He said they had found evidence of what he called a violent incident. He would not give me details over the phone. He only asked if I would be willing to come in and give a formal statement when I returned to Denver. I told him yes. When I asked if they had found anyone in the woods, he went quiet for a second. Then he said they were still investigating and that he could not comment on an active case. The way he said it, the weight in his voice, told me everything I needed to know. They found something in those trees, or someone, and I do not think whoever it was made it out alive. I gave my statement a week later. The detective showed me photos of the rest area in daylight, and it looked so ordinary, so harmless. Just a patch of gravel and grass beside the road. He confirmed that they had recovered the jacket and the gloves, that the blood was human, and that they had found other evidence deeper in the woods that he could not talk about. He asked me again about the figure I had seen, and I told him the same thing I told the operator. Only a silhouette, too dark to make out anything else. He nodded as if he had already expected that answer. When I asked if they had any suspects, he shook his head. There were no witnesses except us, and we had not seen enough to help. That was 6 months ago. I still check the news sometimes, looking for an update, an arrest, anything. There has been nothing. Whoever was in those woods that night is still out there. Sometimes when I drive at night and see a dark exit at the side of the road, I feel my chest tighten and grip the steering wheel harder. I think about that light turning off. I think about that figure standing there, watching us leave, knowing we had seen what he did. And I wonder if that person thinks about us too. Story 6. There were 5 of us packed inside my friend Garrett's old Chevy Suburban that Friday night in March 2024, traveling from Austin to New Orleans for a bachelor party weekend. My friend Milo was getting married in 2 months. We had rented a house in the French Quarter, pooled money for the trip, and asked for the day off work. I had just turned 26 the week before. I was still working as a legal assistant at a small downtown firm, and that trip felt like the kind of escape I desperately needed after months buried in case files. Garrett took the first shift behind the wheel. Milo was in the passenger seat handling the music, and the rest of us, Owen, Lucas, and me, settled into the 2 back rows with a cooler full of sodas and enough snacks to survive an apocalypse. We left around 8 o'clock at night, figuring we would drive through the early morning hours and arrive in the morning. The energy inside the vehicle was electric. 5 guys in their 20s acting like teenagers again, laughing about old college stories and teasing Milo because he was finally going to settle down. We had been on the road maybe 3 hours when we crossed into Louisiana, somewhere past the Texas border, on a stretch of Interstate 10 that felt increasingly lonely. The billboards disappeared, replaced by dense walls of black trees that seemed to close in around the highway. Traffic thinned out until, for long stretches, we were the only lights visible in any direction. Garrett had the cruise control set at 72, just above the limit. Nothing extreme. Owen had fallen asleep against the window, and Lucas was checking his phone with the brightness almost all the way down. Milo and I were debating whether to stop for gas at the next exit or hold out another hour, when Garrett suddenly straightened in his seat and narrowed his eyes at the rearview mirror. Red and blue lights had appeared behind us, flashing through the rear window with an intensity that made me instinctively check whether my seatbelt was fastened. Garrett muttered something under his breath and started slowing down, moving toward the shoulder while the vehicle behind us followed. Its lights painted the dark trees in alternating flashes of color. The first thing I noticed when we came to a complete stop was the vehicle itself. It was a dark-colored SUV, maybe black or very deep blue, but it had no clear markings on the sides. There was no sheriff's star, no state police emblem, no word police anywhere that I could see. The light bar on the roof looked almost homemade, as if someone had installed it on their own, and it was slightly crooked. Owen woke up and asked what was happening, his voice hoarse and confused. Lucas leaned forward between the front seats to try to get a better look. We all stayed silent for what felt like forever, watching the figure inside the SUV through the mirrors. The driver's door finally opened, and a man got out, but he did not walk the way police usually walk during a traffic stop. He moved too quickly, almost eagerly, and approached the driver's window without that cautious posture, with the hand on the hip, that you see in any police procedure on television. He was carrying a flashlight, but he kept it pointed at the ground instead of shining it inside our vehicle. Garrett lowered the window halfway, and the man leaned in too close, much closer than any officer had ever leaned in the few traffic stops I had witnessed. He was dressed in dark clothing, something that looked like a uniform, but not quite. The shirt was plain black, with no badge, no name tag, no department patches. He wore a belt with several objects attached, though in the low light I could not tell what they were. His face was gaunt, with sunken eyes that caught the red glow from his own rear lights. He also had an uneven beard, as if it had been growing without care for weeks. The man smiled at Garrett, but it was one of those smiles that do not reach the eyes, the kind that makes you want to look away. He asked for license and registration in a voice that was too casual, too friendly, as if he were greeting a familiar neighbor instead of conducting an official stop. Garrett handed him the documents, and the man took them without even looking at them. He only held them loosely in his hand while he examined the inside of our truck with those empty eyes. He started asking questions, but none of them had anything to do with the reason he had pulled us over. He wanted to know where we were going, which I suppose was fairly normal. But then he asked how long we planned to stay. He asked if anyone was waiting for us, if we had told our families about the trip, if anyone knew exactly what route we were taking. Milo shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat and said we were only going to New Orleans for a weekend trip, trying to keep the answer vague. The man nodded slowly as if he were recording every word. Then he pointed the flashlight directly at Lucas in the back seat and specifically asked him whether he had a girlfriend waiting for him at home. Lucas stammered a confused yes, and the man asked him if she knew where he was right then, if she would notice if he did not text her that night. The question hung in the air like something rotten. I could feel my pulse in my throat, and I exchanged a look with Owen that confirmed we were both thinking the same thing. Something was very wrong. Garrett finally asked what this was about, why he had been pulled over, and the man only chuckled and said he would get to that. The man stepped away from the window and walked slowly around the front of the Suburban, dragging his fingers across the hood as he moved, as if he were checking it for dust. He stopped on the passenger side and tapped the window with one knuckle, signaling for Milo to lower it. Milo hesitated, looking at Garrett, who gave him a small nod because what else could we do? The guy had lights. He had pulled us over. We were stranded on the side of a dark road in the middle of nowhere in Louisiana. Milo opened the window only a few inches, and the man leaned in to look inside, his face uncomfortably close to the glass. He asked Milo to step out of the vehicle, just like that. with an unsettling casualness as if you were asking him to pass the salt. He said he needed to speak with him privately, that it was standard procedure and would only take a minute. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it inside my ears. Milo asked why, asked what he had done, and the man's expression changed for an instant. Barely a second, something cold and irritated crossing his face before that fake friendliness returned. He repeated that he needed Milo to step out. This time his voice had a different edge. That was when Garrett did something that probably saved us. He took out his phone and said he was going to call 911 to verify the stop. He said he had heard about incidents involving fake police officers and just wanted to make sure everything was legitimate. He said it calmly, almost apologetically, as if he were embarrassed to be cautious. The man outside straightened suddenly, and I saw his entire demeanor change in an instant. The fake smile disappeared completely. He clenched his jaw and took a step back, while his eyes moved quickly toward the SUV parked behind us. He told Garrett that was not necessary, that he was wasting everyone's time, that we could go. Just like that. No ticket. No warning. No explanation for why he had pulled us over in the first place. He did not even return Garrett's license and registration. He simply dropped them on the ground beside the driver's door and started walking back to his vehicle. Now his pace was fast, urgent, completely different from the slow, predatory approach he had used when he first got out. Owen whispered for Garrett to drive, to just go, and Garrett did not need to hear it twice. He put the Suburban in drive and pulled back onto the highway, accelerating faster than I had ever seen him drive. No one said anything for at least a full minute. We just stayed there in the glow of the dashboard lights, breathing hard, trying to understand what had just happened. Lucas was the first to speak, asking if that guy was even a real police officer, and none of us had an answer. I turned in my seat to look at the SUV behind us, half expecting it to follow, but its lights suddenly shut off. The red and blue lights stopped flashing. The headlights also went completely dark, and the vehicle stayed there on the shoulder like something dead. Then it made a U-turn across the median, something no police officer would do, and disappeared in the opposite direction with no lights on. We watched until it was lost in the darkness, and then we all started talking at the same time, our voices overlapping with fear, confusion, and adrenaline. Milo kept repeating that he had almost gotten out of the car, that he had actually touched the handle before the man's questions became too strange. That thought gave me a kind of nausea that is hard to describe. We drove another 40 minutes without stopping, constantly checking the mirrors, flinching at every pair of headlights that appeared behind us. Garrett kept the speed exactly at the limit, terrified of being pulled over again, but also terrified of staying on that stretch of road any longer than necessary. When we finally saw a well-lit gas station near the next exit, we pulled in without even discussing it. The fluorescent lights felt like a sanctuary after all that darkness. We parked near the entrance, where other cars were getting gas, where there were cameras, people, and the normal sounds of a convenience store operating in the middle of the night. I got out with shaky legs and stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of gasoline and fried food coming from inside, trying to hold on to something normal. That was when we saw a Louisiana State Police vehicle parked across the lot. A real one, with proper markings and a uniformed officer sitting inside, filling out paperwork. Owen suggested we go talk to him and tell him what had happened. After a brief discussion, we all agreed. We needed to know if what we had experienced was as wrong as it had felt. The officer's name was printed on a badge pinned to his chest, and he looked up from his clipboard with the tired patience of someone who had worked night shifts for years. We must have looked pretty shaken because he immediately asked if we were okay, if there had been an accident. Garrett explained what had happened. The unmarked SUV, the crooked light bar, the man dressed all in black asking invasive questions, the attempt to separate Milo from the group. The officer's expression changed as Garrett spoke. It went from polite attention to genuine concern. He leaned forward in his seat and asked us to describe the vehicle again, to describe the man, to be precise about exactly where on the interstate it had happened. When Garrett finished, the officer stayed quiet for a moment. Then he told us something that chilled my stomach. He said there were no authorized units operating in that area that night. No sheriff's deputies, no state troopers, no federal vehicles. He told us we needed to file an official report immediately, and his voice had a gravity that made it clear this was not the first time he had heard a story like ours. We spent the next 2 hours at a state police station beside the highway, giving statements and descriptions to a detective who recorded everything on a digital device. She asked us to remember every possible detail: the shape of the light bar, the exact words of the questions, the way the man moved, any distinguishing feature of his appearance or his vehicle. Lucas remembered that the SUV had a small dent on the front bumper on the driver's side. Owen remembered that the man was wearing boots that looked military, not the polished shoes a real officer would wear. I remembered his hands, the long dirty fingernails, and a faded tattoo on his left wrist that seemed to have numbers or letters, though I could not make it out well in the dark. The detective wrote everything down without expression, but when we finished, she thanked us in a way that felt heavy, meaningful. She said our description matched 2 other reports from the last 18 months, incidents that had happened on the same stretch of road involving a similar vehicle and a man who fit the same general appearance. She did not tell us what had happened in those other cases, and I did not ask. I was too afraid of the answer. We arrived in New Orleans at dawn, but after that, the bachelor party felt empty. We went through with the plans, the dinners, the bars, the laughter that came out too loud and died too quickly. But none of us could shake what had happened on that dark stretch of Interstate 10. Milo kept going back to the moment when he almost opened the door. He kept repeating that he could still feel the handle under his fingers. He kept wondering what would have happened if he had stepped out onto the side of the road in the middle of the night with that man. We never found out who he was. The detective called Garrett a few weeks later to tell him the investigation was still open, that they had increased patrols in that area, but as far as I know, there was never an arrest. Sometimes I search online for news about that road, about missing people or attacks on travelers in rural Louisiana, and I find enough to keep me awake at night. I think about how easy it would have been for us to become one of those stories. I think about how the only thing that saved us was Garrett's instinct to pick up his phone. And I think about that man, still somewhere out there, waiting on a dark shoulder with his crooked lights flashing, hoping the next group of travelers will be a little less cautious than we were. Story 7. That morning marked the 3rd stretch of our trip through a wide, silent part of the country, where towns seem more like suggestions on the map than real places. The trip was supposed to help us reset things a little. A low-budget escape after months of stress, balancing work deadlines and school schedules. We were tired of chain hotels and thought a small roadside lodge would give us a story to laugh about later. The listing promised clean rooms, hot showers, and old-fashioned quiet, which sounded perfect after so many hours listening to the engine. My partner Sarah was checking the reviews while I drove, and none of them seemed to raise any obvious red flags. The kids were restless but excited, counting down the miles as if it were a game. When the GPS told us to turn onto a narrow gravel road, I remember thinking how empty everything looked. The field stretched out on both sides, and the silence came down over us as soon as we slowed. The lodge appeared in front of us like something stopped in time, set back from the road, with a faded sign and windows clouded by dirt. The paint peeled away in long strips, and weeds grew through the cracks in the parking lot as if no one bothered fighting them anymore. There were no cars parked outside, not even near the entrance, which felt strange for mid-afternoon. A single figure came out through the office door. He was a man with stiff posture and clothes that looked more asleep on him than simply worn. He spoke politely, but he did not make conversation. His answers were short, and his eyes drifted past us instead of meeting ours. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something sour I could not identify. Inside the office, half the lights were off, and a dusty fan hummed without moving much air. Sarah and I exchanged a look, the kind that says, "You're noticing it too, but you still don't want to scare the kids." The room itself was functional, but unsettling, as if it had been cleaned just enough to pass a quick glance. The curtains were heavy and blocked out most of the daylight. making the space feel smaller than it really was. As we unpacked, I heard a dull thud coming from somewhere behind the building. It was irregular and low, like something heavy being moved. Sarah tried to open a side exit near the vending machines, only to discover that it was locked from the outside, which made no sense in an area meant for guests. Another door near the back stairs was blocked the same way. When I stepped outside to get some air, I caught sight of several objects hidden behind a dumpster. A worn backpack, a single sneaker, and a phone case split in half. They did not look like trash. They were not placed like waste, but hidden, pushed out of sight. The noise started again, this time closer, and the skin on my arms prickled despite the heat. We did not announce our decision, but it happened at the same time. Sarah quietly told the kids to put their shoes back on and grab their bags without asking questions. I went to the office to return the key, and the man looked surprised, almost annoyed when I told him we were leaving early. He did not ask why. He only took the key and slid it into a drawer that was already full of them. Outside, the sky was beginning to lean toward evening, and the shadows stretched across the empty parking lot. As we drove away, I checked the rear-view mirror more than necessary, half expecting headlights to appear behind us. None did, but the feeling of relief did not arrive until the lodge disappeared from view. We never reported the place, mostly because we did not know what to say without sounding paranoid. Even now, I think about those hidden belongings and wonder who they belonged to, and whether leaving before nightfall was the only reason we made it back onto the road safe and sound. We kept driving until the road finally led us to a stretch with real traffic, the kind where headlights passed often enough to remind you that other people existed. No one spoke for a while, not even the kids, and that told me more than any question could have. The radio played softly, some talk show fading in and out every time the hills interrupted the signal. Every now and then, Sarah looked at me as if she wanted to say something, but then stopped. My thoughts kept returning to the locked exits, to the way they were not stuck or broken but deliberately secured. That detail stayed with me more than the noise or the empty parking lot. It suggested planning, not neglect. By the time the sun sank lower, the tension inside the car felt heavier than the luggage in the trunk. We pulled into a small gas station just before nightfall, one of those places with buzzing lights and a single cashier behind thick glass. While I filled the tank, I noticed that my hands were still not steady, even though we were clearly in an open place. Sarah took the kids to the bathroom, and I stayed beside the pump, scanning the parking lot out of habit. A family minivan pulled in, then a pickup, and the normalness of it all felt almost unreal. Inside, Sarah mentioned that one of the kids had asked her why the doors at the lodge were locked. She had brushed it off by saying it was probably an old building problem. The lie sounded weak, even to her own ears. We agreed not to stop at any isolated place again that day, no matter how tired we were. As night fell, the image of those objects behind the building kept replaying in my head. They were not deteriorated enough to have been there very long, and they did not seem to belong together, which made it worse. I thought about going back earlier, about convincing myself we were overreacting, but the idea of returning after dark made my chest tighten. At some point, Sarah suggested calling a non-emergency line to report the locked exits and the abandoned feeling of the place. We talked it over and realized we had no concrete proof of anything, only instincts and fragments. Still, instincts exist for a reason, and ignoring them had never ended well for anyone I knew. We decided that if we saw the lodge advertised again during the trip, we would leave a warning review without accusations, only facts. We reached a busier town late that night and checked into a chain hotel that smelled like chlorine and coffee. The relief was immediate and almost embarrassing, as if we had escaped something without knowing exactly what. The kids finally relaxed, laughing in front of the TV while eating snacks from a vending machine that actually worked. Sarah and I stayed awake longer than usual, going over the day in low voices, making sure our memories matched. Nothing else happened that night. No calls, no strange encounters, only sleep that came heavily but stayed. Even now, years later, I cannot explain what that lodge was really being used for. All I know is that leaving when we did felt like a decision that closed a door we never should have opened. The next morning, the trip continued under a pale sky, and the previous day felt unreal in a way that made the details sharper instead of fading. Every time we passed an exit toward open land, I felt a small rise in tension, as if my body remembered something my mind wanted to push away. The kids asked if we could ever go back to a place like that lodge, with the kind of curiosity only children can have. Sarah quickly answered that some places simply are not made for families. I kept replaying the man's expression when we returned the key, the way he did not even bother pretending to be interested. It was not exactly hostility, but more like impatience, as if we had interrupted a routine he expected to continue. That stayed with me more than the noise. A routine implies repetition, and repetition implies others. A few days later, when we were already back home and the trip was officially over, I tried to search for the lodge again. The listing was still there, with the same photos, the same cheerful and vague descriptions. I checked the recent reviews and noticed something unsettling. Gaps, weeks with nothing, and then suddenly a brief comment that was too positive, one that seemed written to fill space more than to describe a real stay. I wrote a careful review, limiting myself to what we had experienced without speculating. I mentioned the absence of guests, the locked exits, and the belongings behind the building, choosing words that could not be dismissed as dramatic. Publishing it felt heavier than it should have, like tossing a note into deep water and hoping someone else would find it. Soon after, the listing disappeared completely. No explanation, no archived page, it simply vanished. Sarah noticed it first and called me. We stared at the screen longer than necessary. I checked other booking sites, different ways of spelling the name, even the location itself on the map. The place still existed in satellite view, but no lodging information appeared anymore. That was the closest thing to an answer we ever got, and it did not feel comforting. If anything, it confirmed that something about that place did not survive attention. We briefly talked about contacting the authorities again, but without the listing and without new information, it felt like chasing a shadow. Life went on as it always does, but that day still returns in quiet moments. Sometimes it is triggered by a roadside sign advertising cheap rooms, or a stretch where the silence feels too intentional. I do not tell this story to scare people away from travel or small towns. I share it because sometimes the safest decision does not come with proof or validation, only a very strong internal warning. We trusted that warning and left while the sun was still up. Whatever happened at that lodge after dark or before we arrived remains unknown to us. And honestly, not knowing feels like the best possible ending. That stretch of road remains in my memory like a long breath I never finished releasing. Story 8. I was on a road trip with my friend Logan, crossing the state to clear my head after a complicated few months at work. At the time, it felt like my life was on pause, as if I were floating between decisions, filling the days with movement just to avoid staying still. We were in no hurry to get anywhere. We just drove, talked, and stopped for gas whenever the tank got too low. As the afternoon went on, the road became emptier, and the landscape flattened into open fields and distant tree lines. The radio stations disappeared one by one until static filled the car. Everything felt normal in that rural middle-of-nowhere way that you do not question until later. Looking back, the silence should have felt like a warning, but it did not. The car failed without drama. First, there was a sudden loss of power, and then a smooth roll onto the shoulder. Logan tried to start it several times while I lifted the hood. Even though I know nothing about engines, the air smelled hot and dry, and the wind kicked up road dust that got into my mouth. My phone had no signal, not even one bar. Logan checked his too, then laughed and said that in a way, it was nice to be unreachable. We decided to wait, assuming someone would pass by sooner or later. Cars were scarce out there, which made each one feel louder and more obvious. That was when the pickup appeared for the first time. It came from behind us, dark-colored and older, with a rattle that lingered in the air even after it passed. The driver slowed down just enough to look, turning his head toward us before the truck accelerated again. A few minutes later, the same pickup returned from the opposite direction, this time slowing even more. Logan joked that the guy must be lost, but his voice did not sound convinced. The third pass was slower than the second. The tires crunched over the gravel near the shoulder. I noticed how the truck stayed lined up with us longer than necessary. When it finally moved on, the silence it left behind felt heavier than before. We stopped joking. Then the pickup came back again, and this time it did not pass by. It stopped a little farther ahead, with its hazard lights blinking in an irregular rhythm. The driver got out slowly. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low and boots that looked too clean for someone coming to help on the side of the road. He asked if we needed help. His voice was calm but strangely flat, as if he were reciting lines he had rehearsed. Logan thanked him and said someone was already on the way, even though that was not true. The man stood there, insisting. He offered tools, a ride, anything that would get us into his truck. His eyes kept moving between us and our car, never staying fixed long enough to seem normal. When we refused again, his expression hardened just slightly before he nodded and returned to his pickup. We waited until the sound of the engine disappeared before either of us spoke. We sat inside the car with the doors locked and the windows barely cracked to let in some air. Time stretched in a strange way out there. Every minute felt slow and urgent at the same time. I kept watching the road in both directions, expecting the pickup to reappear at any second. Logan tried to keep the mood light, talking about the food we would buy once we got back to civilization, but he kept glancing at the rearview mirror. Finally, another vehicle passed, a sedan that did not slow down at all, and for a moment that felt worse than being noticed. The sun started to drop, dragging long shadows across the asphalt. That was when I understood how exposed we were. Two people stranded with nowhere to go if someone decided to stop again. The pickup returned just as the light began to soften with the start of evening. This time it slowed even more, almost crawling beside us, before stopping several car lengths behind. The driver did not get out right away. He sat there with the engine running, the window halfway down, watching us through the side mirror. Logan whispered that we should stay still and not react. When the man finally got out, he did not smile or speak at first. He came closer than before, close enough that I could smell oil and cigarettes on his clothes. He repeated his offer to help, but now his tone was harder, less friendly. We told him again that we were fine, that assistance was on the way. He looked at us for a second too long. Then he returned to his truck without another word and left so fast that he kicked up a cloud of dust. After that, we barely talked. The silence felt intentional, as if speaking could draw attention back to us. Finally, a roadside assistance truck appeared from the opposite direction, with flashing lights that felt unreal because of how relieved we were. The driver went straight to work, hooking up the car and asking quick questions while I kept watching the road. I half expected the pickup to come roaring back before we left. When we pulled away, I looked back at the stretch of road getting smaller behind us, trying to memorize every detail in case it mattered later. Logan let out a long sigh and said he had not realized how tense he was until that moment. We ended up in a small town not far from there, waiting in a diner while the car was inspected. The place smelled like grease and burnt coffee, something strangely comforting because it was familiar. While Logan spoke with the mechanic, I checked local news using the restaurant's weak Wi-Fi. That was when I saw it. A short article buried almost at the bottom of the page. It mentioned a recent series of roadside robberies on a nearby highway. All of them involved stranded drivers and a dark pickup that circled before the attacks. The descriptions matched too closely to ignore. I read it twice, then a third time. With every detail, my chest tightened more. I showed the article to Logan, and the color drained from his face as he read it. The robberies had not happened far from where our car broke down, and the pattern was almost identical. The victims had accepted help or rides, believing they had no other choice. The article did not say whether anyone had been arrested. We paid the bill and left without finishing our food. Both of us stayed quiet for the rest of the way. Even now, I think about how easy it would have been for everything to end differently if we had made one small decision. That day taught me how thin the line can be between an inconvenience and something much worse, especially when you are alone on the road. The rest of the trip felt longer than the miles marked on the map. Every pickup we passed made my shoulders tense, even hours later, when the landscape changed and traffic increased. We did not play music. We did not talk about what had almost happened. It was as if saying it out loud might give it more weight than we were ready to carry. When we finally reached our destination, the exhaustion hit us all at once. The kind of exhaustion that appears after you have stayed alert for too long. That night I could not stop replaying the man's pauses, the way he lingered too long, the fact that he had come back more than once. None of it screamed a danger on its own, but all of it together formed something impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, I could not stop checking the news from that area. A few more reports appeared, then nothing. No arrest, no closure. Logan and I talked about it one more time. Then we sat in silence, both of us knowing how close we had come without even agreeing on the details. He admitted that he had considered getting into the truck just to end the waiting. That scared me more than the stranger himself. It made me understand how vulnerability changes your judgment, how exhaustion and isolation can make a bad idea seem reasonable. After that trip, I started carrying extra water, a paper map, and a roadside kit. Not because I thought being prepared would make me brave, but because I never wanted to feel that powerless again. Sometimes I still imagine that road, how wide and empty it was, how easy it would have been for something terrible to happen with no witnesses. The scariest thing was not the man or the truck, but how ordinary it all felt while it was happening. There was no dramatic moment, no clear sign, just a slow-growing feeling that something was not right. To this day, I do not know what the driver intended or how many people were not as lucky as we were. Maybe he was involved, maybe he was not. All I know is that we left that road intact because we trusted our instincts and stayed where we were. Even when waiting became unbearable, that experience changed the way I see quiet places and strangers who offer help. Some stretches of road do not forgive small mistakes, and some warnings do not arrive with sirens or signs. They arrive as repetition, patience, and the feeling that someone is watching you a little too closely. Story 9. That morning, the trip still felt simple, almost boring. It was the kind of drive you take to clear your mind. The plan was to cross several states in one shot. It was only Mason, Riley, and me taking turns behind the wheel, chasing that light feeling that comes when the road keeps unfolding in front of you without ever seeming to end. At the time, my life was stable, but dull. Long weeks of work, cheap takeout, and the feeling that every day looked too much like the one before it. A road trip felt like pressing pause, even if only for a weekend. The car smelled like gas station coffee and the citrus wipes Riley kept running over the dashboard. We joked about playlists, missed exits, and the way the GPS always sounded like it was annoyed with us. Nothing about that day suggested it would stay with me for so long. By late afternoon, the highway started to empty out. Traffic dissolved into long stretches of silence between one car and the next. Without warning, the GPS rerouted us, insisting that we take a narrow exit through farmland instead of continuing straight. At first, it did not seem dangerous. Soft hills, endless fences, and fields that looked more abandoned than worked. The cell signal disappeared bar by bar until the screen showed nothing but the map and our blinking dot. Mason tapped the phone lightly with his finger, as if that would fix it, and laughed it off. But the laugh did not last long. The road narrowed. The asphalt began to crack in uneven patches, and the sky started turning a heavy gray. We passed no houses, no stores, only mailboxes leading at odd angles. Eventually, we reached a small cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town. A gas pump with peeling paint, a diner with a flickering light, and a handful of trucks parked as if they had been there forever. We stopped, relieved to see people. Inside the diner, the air smelled like old grease and burnt coffee, and the conversations died the second we walked in. The locals stared openly at us, not with curiosity but with vigilance. I asked an older man behind the counter how we could get back to the highway, trying to sound friendly. He did not answer right away. He only looked past me toward the window, and then muttered something about taking the long way. Another woman shook her head and whispered that the roads were not safe after dark, without explaining why. When we went back outside, the sun was already sinking, and the shadows were stretching too quickly across the dirt lot. Mason pointed out that one of the trucks had started its engine just as we came out. The sound was low and deliberate. As we drove away, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, then another farther back. No one passed us, no one honked. They simply stayed there, matching our speed. Riley tried to use the GPS again, but the screen was still frozen, useless. The silence inside the car felt heavier than the night beginning to fall around us. That was the moment the trip stopped feeling like an escape and started feeling like a mistake. The farther we went, the more deliberate everything seemed, as if the road itself were closing in around us. The pavement turned into gravel in places, and the tires crunched louder than they should have. The vehicles behind us multiplied until I counted 3 pairs of headlights, evenly spaced, never turning away. Mason kept checking the mirrors, his jaw tight. He said they were probably locals going home, but his voice did not match his words. Riley suggested turning around, but the idea of going back and passing that diner again made my chest tighten. There were no streetlights, only our headlights opening a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Every farmhouse we passed sat far from the road, with black windows, as if no one lived there. We slowed near a fork, unsure which direction to take, and that was when one of the vehicles behind us flashed its high beams. It was a sudden, sharp burst. A second later, another did the same, as if it were a signal. Mason accelerated. Dust rose behind the car, and the headlights closed the distance almost immediately. A truck pulled up beside us long enough for me to see a silhouette leaning toward the window, one arm resting outside before dropping back again. No one tried to pass us. They did not need to. They seemed content to keep us where we were. My thoughts circled around the same question. Why not just let us go? Riley spotted a faded sign half buried in the weeds pointing toward the highway, or at least toward what we hoped was the highway. Mason took the turn without slowing down, and the car shook as it entered a much rougher stretch. The vehicles behind us hesitated for the first time, their engines roaring louder as they adjusted course. One turned off and disappeared down a side road, but 2 stayed behind us. The road climbed a small hill and then dropped sharply, with trees closing in on both sides. For a moment, the headlights disappeared behind a curve, and the silence felt unreal, like holding your breath underwater. That relief shattered when the headlights reappeared, closer than before. Mason pushed the car harder than he ever had. The engine began to complain with a strained hum. The road straightened, and farther ahead, faint but unmistakable, the reflective markers of the highway appeared. As soon as our tires touched smooth asphalt, the vehicles slowed and then stopped completely. Their headlights shut off one by one. We did not slow down. We did not look back. The rest of the drive passed in a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. Each of us kept replaying the same images in our heads, trying to make sense of something that refused to feel accidental. When we stopped at a rest area, none of us got out of the car right away. The lights buzzed above us, bright and sterile, and it felt strange to see other travelers moving around as if nothing had happened. Mason finally turned off the engine and sat there, his hand still on the wheel, breathing slowly as if trying not to shake. Riley broke the silence by saying that, when said out loud, the whole thing sounded insane, and somehow that made it worse. We went over every second, the looks in that diner, the way the trucks moved in sync, the silence when we asked simple questions. No one had a theory that made sense. We only agreed on one thing. It had not been a coincidence. Later that night, in a motel where we had not planned to stop, sleep did not come easily. Every headlight passing on the other side of the curtains made me tense, listening to see if any engine slowed down. I started searching online without knowing exactly what I was looking for. I only typed fragments of what we had experienced. Among local forums and old news posts, I found mentions of stranded drivers, assaults that were never solved, and people found injured on back roads without remembering who helped them or who hurt them. The locations were vague, with no clear names, but the details matched in uncomfortable ways. The comments were worse than the articles. People from the area warning outsiders not to take detours, not to trust shortcuts. Seeing it written by strangers made my skin crawl. The next morning, we decided not to report anything. That decision still bothers me. But at the time, we did not know how to explain what had happened without sounding out of control. We had no license plates, no faces, no clear crime. Only fear and instinct. Instead, Mason manually changed the rest of the route, checking every stop 3 times. Riley barely joked again. He looked out the window as if the landscape itself could turn against us. We stayed on the main highways, ignored every suggested shortcut, and did not stop unless there were people around. The trip ended earlier than planned, not because of the distance, but because none of us wanted to keep pretending it was still fun. What stayed with me was not just the fear, but how coordinated it all felt. Those people did not panic or rush. They controlled the pace, the silence, even the road. Whatever happens out there does not depend on luck or simple opportunity. It depends on travelers trusting a screen to guide them into an unfamiliar place. I still take road trips, but now I plan them like a paranoid person. Offline maps, printed routes, and one absolute rule: never follow a detour when the signal disappears. There are places that do not want visitors, and they make that clear in ways that never appear on a map.